Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe.
Marisol Vega had always believed that words could save a person. As a child growing up in the hills outside San Isidoro, a quiet town in the Mexican state of Valle Verde, she learned early how to disappear into books. By the time she was 5, she could read fluently, sounding out sentences aloud while her mother cooked or folded laundry nearby. Stories were her refuge. She loved novels that spoke about purpose, destiny, and endurance, and she carried her favorites until their spines bent and pages yellowed. When asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, Marisol never answered with a job title. She said she wanted to be strong enough to choose. Her mother, Lucia Vega, raised Marisol and her younger sister alone for most of their childhood. Their father, Rafael Morales, had moved to the United States when Marisol was still young, settling in Southern California and working long hours to support the family from afar. Money was never plentiful, but the household was rich in routine. Marisol woke early, helped her sister get ready for school, kept her room immaculate, and organized her notebooks with color-coded precision. She was disciplined in a way that felt innate, not forced. She loved music and movement. On weekends, she danced barefoot in the courtyard while lavender and rosemary dried on strings overhead. She kept plants wherever sunlight would allow, nurturing them carefully, talking to them as if they were listening. Friends described her as calm but intense, the kind of person who noticed everything and wasted nothing. She didn't drink, didn't party, didn't rush. She planned. When Marisol turned 21, her life shifted in a way she had long anticipated. Through her father's residency status, she became a naturalized U.S. citizen. It was something they had discussed for years during late-night phone calls and holiday visits. To Marisol, citizenship was not just paperwork, it was possibility. She told her mother she wanted to do something meaningful with it, something that proved she deserved the opportunity she'd been given. That was when she decided to enlist. Lucia tried to hide her worry, but it lived behind her eyes. She had heard stories about the military, about how young women were treated, about how far away everything would be. But Marisol was determined. She spoke about discipline, structure, and service. She said the military would help her grow, help her earn stability, help her build a future that belonged to her alone. Eventually, Lucia stopped arguing and started praying. Marisol moved to the United States in early 2020, just as the world seemed to hold its breath. The pandemic delayed nearly everything. Her training was postponed, her plans suspended in uncertainty. For nearly a year, she waited, living modestly near her father's apartment, keeping herself busy with exercise, reading, and language practice. She didn't complain, but the waiting wore on her. She had chosen a path that required movement, and stillness felt like failure. In the summer of 2021, she finally received orders to begin basic training. She hugged her father tightly before leaving, promising to call whenever she could. From the beginning, the letters and messages she sent home were careful, measured. She spoke about the physical demands, the strict schedules, the exhaustion that left her falling asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. She never exaggerated, never dramatized. She wanted her family to be proud, not afraid. After training, Marisol was assigned to an engineering unit stationed at Redstone Garrison, a massive military installation in central Texas. The base was isolated, surrounded by miles of dry land and long roads that led nowhere quickly. She was told she would be there for just over a year, after which she could choose whether to re-enlist or return to civilian life. From the moment she arrived, she began counting down. At first, she tried to adapt. She kept her bunk spotless, volunteered for extra duties, and avoided conflict whenever possible. But within weeks, her tone changed. Calls became shorter. Messages lost their warmth. When Lucia asked how she was doing, Marisol hesitated before answering. She said the environment was tense. She said some people didn't respect boundaries. She said she felt watched. Eventually, the truth emerged in fragments. Marisol confided in her mother that one of her superiors made inappropriate comments, that others brushed against her unnecessarily, that jokes turned sexual the moment no one else was around. She said she tried to ignore it, to stay focused, to avoid drawing attention, but the pressure followed her everywhere. Friends on base later confirmed what she had hinted at, telling reporters anonymously that Marisol was often targeted and visibly uncomfortable. She told me everyone there wanted something from her, and not in a good way, one friend said. Lucia remembered one phone call in particular. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said she was tired of being treated like an object. She said she couldn't trust anyone. "I just want to finish my contract and leave. I don't belong here." By early 2023, Marisol's mental state had noticeably declined. She sounded exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. She told her father that she felt trapped, that her life felt wrong, that she couldn't see a future past the base gates. Once, in a moment that would haunt him forever, she said she wished she could disappear. Raphael tried to reassure her, told her she was strong, told her this was temporary. He urged her to seek help, to talk to someone. She said she would. The last conversation they had was on a Saturday in March. Marisol told him she was frustrated and overwhelmed. She said she hadn't been sleeping well. Raphael sensed something was off, but nothing in her voice suggested finality. They said goodbye like they always did, promising to talk soon. The next day, her messages were unanswered. At first, Raphael assumed she was busy or resting, but by Monday, her texts were no longer delivered. When he checked her location through a shared app, it showed her phone at a small park on the base. He felt a knot form in his stomach. That morning, 2 uniformed officers arrived at his workplace. They told him his daughter had been found dead inside a maintenance facility on the base. They spoke carefully, formally. They suggested she had taken her own life. Raphael barely heard the words. They didn't fit. They couldn't fit. He had spoken to her days before. She had plans. She had dreams. She had fear, yes, but fear was not the same as wanting to die. When Lucia was told, she collapsed. The military released a brief statement days later saying there was no evidence of foul play. Investigators claimed the case was under review, but no additional details were provided. Both parents asked questions and received silence in return. They were not shown the scene. They were not given timelines. They were told to wait. As Marisol's death became public, others began to speak. Former service members shared stories of harassment at Redstone Garrison. Advocacy groups pointed to a long history of unexplained deaths and ignored complaints. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. Lucia applied for an emergency visa to travel to the United States, desperate to be closer to whatever truth might emerge. She wanted answers. She wanted accountability. Most of all, she wanted to know what really happened to the daughter who once believed words could save a life. And this was only the beginning. By the time winter loosened its grip on the high desert, Lucia Morales had learned to measure her days in routines: morning formation, equipment checks, the low, constant thrum of engines drifting across the base like an artificial tide. Fort Calderon was a self-contained world built to function without curiosity, a place where schedules mattered more than people, and silence was often mistaken for discipline. Lucia had arrived believing she could make sense of it. She was wrong. Her unit assignment placed her with the 118th Engineering Support Group, a practical role on paper: infrastructure maintenance, logistics, and field support. Nothing glamorous, nothing overtly dangerous. The reality was a culture that rewarded endurance and punished complaint. Lucia noticed it almost immediately: the jokes that landed a little too close to home, the lingering looks during briefings, the way certain names were spoken with an edge that meant power, not respect. At first, she brushed it aside. She had grown up navigating tight spaces, emotional and physical. In La Esperanza, she had learned to stay focused, to keep her head down when necessary. She told herself this was no different, but it was. This was a system with rank stitched into every interaction, where saying no came with consequences that were never written down. She called her mother less often than she meant to. When she did, she kept the conversations light. She talked about the weather, about learning new procedures, about how strange it was to live somewhere that felt so temporary. What she did not say was that she had started sleeping with the lights on, or that she felt watched even when she was alone. Her father, Mateo Morales, heard the strain anyway. He lived in San Aurelio, a coastal city 2 hours south, and had been waiting years for this chapter of Lucia's life to begin. He had helped with the paperwork, the citizenship process, the late-night calls when the forms didn't make sense. When she finally enlisted, he had told everyone he knew that his daughter was brave, strong, capable of anything. Now, when he heard her voice crack at the edges, those words felt hollow. In late January, Lucia confided in him during a rare, unguarded call. She spoke quickly, as if afraid of being overheard even through the phone. She said a supervisor had been too friendly, that others had made comment that made her skin crawl, that she felt trapped between wanting to finish her contract and wanting to leave immediately. "I can handle it," she said, the way children say they are not afraid of the dark. Mateo did not argue. He knew better. He told her he loved her. He told her to document everything. He told her to trust her instincts. When the call ended, he sat in his car for a long time, staring at the dashboard, feeling the old helplessness creep back in. On base, the weeks blurred together. Lucia stopped attending group activities outside of duty hours. She spent her evenings reading novels she had brought from home, dog-eared copies of stories about people who chose their own endings. Lavender oil sat on her bedside table, a small indulgence she hoped no one would notice. When the lights went out, she closed her eyes and tried to imagine fields instead of concrete. Her friends noticed the change. Yelena Vargas, who bunked 2 doors down, told a local Spanish-language news outlet months later that Lucia had grown quieter, more inward. She was still kind, still helpful, but it was like she was carrying something heavy all the time. The weight became harder to hide as spring approached. There were days Lucia barely spoke during meals. Other days she laughed too loudly, as if trying to convince herself she was still the same person. She filed no formal complaints, not because nothing was happening, but because she had seen what happened to those who did. Reassignments, isolation, the subtle erosion of credibility. On Saturday, March 18th, Lucia called her father again. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She said she was exhausted, that she felt like her life had gone off course, that she wanted it all to stop. Mateo listened, his heart pounding, searching for the right words. He urged her to seek help, to talk to someone on base, to come stay with him if she could get leave. She promised she would think about it. The next day, he texted her a photo of the ocean near his apartment, a reminder of home. The message showed as delivered, but there was no reply. By Monday morning, the messages stopped going through altogether. Mateo checked the location sharing they had enabled months earlier. The signal hovered near a green patch on the edge of Fort Calderon, close to a cluster of service buildings most people never noticed. He told himself it was a glitch. Technology failed all the time. Still, a knot formed in his stomach. That afternoon, 2 uniformed officers arrived at his workplace. They asked to speak with him privately. Their expressions were neutral, rehearsed. They told him Lucia had been found unresponsive in a maintenance facility on base. They said there were no signs of a struggle. They said it appeared she had taken her own life. The words felt unreal, like a language Matteo did not understand. He asked questions that went unanswered. How long she had been there, who found her, why he was hearing this now. The officers offered consolances and little else. Lucia's mother, Sofia Morales, learned the news from across the border. Matteo called her, his voice breaking as he tried to explain. Sofia refused to accept it. She said her daughter was afraid, yes, but not hopeless. She said Lucia loved too deeply to disappear without a fight. Within hours, she began the process of applying for an emergency visa, determined to stand on the same ground where her daughter's life had ended. The base issued a brief statement 3 days later. No foul play suspected, an internal review underway. Privacy concerns limited what could be shared. It was written in the language of procedure, not grief. As the news spread, reporters began to ask questions. Former service members came forward with stories that sounded painfully familiar. Unreported harassment, disciplinary systems that protected the wrong people, a pattern of tragedies explained away as isolated incidents. Matteo and Sofia gave separate interviews, their words echoing each other despite the distance. They spoke about the daughter they knew, the books she loved, the future she had planned after her contract ended. They spoke about unanswered messages and unanswered questions. Behind the scenes, multiple investigations were opened, military oversight units, criminal inquiry divisions, committees tasked with examining culture and conduct. Each one promised transparency. Each one moved slowly. In the weeks that followed, Lucia's room was cleared. Her belongings were catalogued and boxed. The lavender oil was listed as personal effects. Her books were returned to Matteo with stiff condolences. Nothing explained how a young woman who had survived so much had reached such a final moment. At Fort Calderon, life went on. Formations continued. Engines hummed. New recruits arrived, carrying the same hopes Lucia once had. But for those who had known her, there was a quiet shift, a sense that something important had been lost and that the reasons for its loss were still being carefully avoided. By the time Sofia's visa was approved, the official narrative had hardened, a conclusion without context, a tragedy without accountability. She arrived determined to push back against it, even if she did not yet know how. Sofia Morales arrived in the United States on a gray morning that felt heavier than the weather deserved. San Aurelio's warmth was still clinging to her clothes, but Fort Calderon stood cold and distant, a maze of fences and guarded checkpoints that made grief feel procedural. She carried a single folder filled with copies of Lucia's documents, photographs from childhood, and handwritten notes she had made during sleepless nights. This was all she had left to fight with. From the moment she stepped onto the base, Sofia sensed resistance, not open hostility, not outright dismissal, something subtler, polite distance, conversations that ended just as they began. Officials met her with condolences and careful phrasing, repeating what Matteo had already been told. The investigation was ongoing, there was no indication of wrongdoing, certain details could not be shared. Sofia listened, nodded, and asked questions anyway. She wanted to know why Lucia had been found alone in a restricted maintenance facility, why no one noticed her absence sooner, why complaints, if they existed, had never been escalated. Each question was met with the same answer, reshaped but unchanged: protocol, privacy, procedure. Outside the base, the story refused to stay contained. Advocacy groups began reaching out to the family. Journalists requested interviews. Former service members shared their experiences anonymously, describing Fort Calderon as a place where silence was safer than truth. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore, even if officials insisted each case stood alone. Matteo took time off work to help Sofia navigate the legal landscape. They met with attorneys who specialized in military cases, each warning them of the same thing. These fights were long, painfully slow, often inconclusive, but none told them to stop. What kept them moving forward was the memory of Lucia as she had been before the uniform, a girl who organized her books by color and theme, a teenager who danced barefoot in the kitchen, a young woman who believed that endurance meant something, that sacrifice would be met with respect. As weeks passed, the internal investigation concluded with no new public findings. The statement released was brief and final in tone. Lucia Morales had died by her own hand. No evidence of external involvement. Case closed. Sophia read the statement twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back into her folder. "They want us to accept this," she said quietly to Mateo. "But acceptance is not the same as truth." They decided to push beyond official channels. A civil inquiry was requested. Congressional representatives were contacted. Sophia spoke at a small vigil organized by other families who had lost loved ones at Fort Calderon. Standing under dim lights, she told Lucia's story not as a headline, but as a life interrupted. She spoke about the phone calls that grew shorter, the joy that slowly drained from her daughter's voice, the fear Lucia had named but never escaped. The crowd listened in silence. Some cried, others nodded, recognizing pieces of their own stories in hers. Pressure began to build. Media coverage expanded. Questions were raised about command oversight and reporting mechanisms. An independent review panel announced it would re-examine conditions at the base, citing community concern and systemic issues. The language was cautious, but it was more than the family had been given before. Behind closed doors, investigators interviewed personnel who had known Lucia. Some spoke openly for the first time, others claimed ignorance. Records were reviewed, timelines reconstructed. Nothing dramatic emerged, no single revelation that changed everything at once. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of inconsistencies, missed opportunities, red flags that had been noticed but never acted upon. For Sophia, the process was exhausting. Each day brought new information, but no closure. Still, she refused to return home. She rented a small room near the base and spent her evenings writing letters to officials, to advocacy groups, to Lucia, in a journal she kept hidden in her suitcase. Mateo struggled in quieter ways. He returned to work but found it hard to focus. The ocean he once sent Lucia photos of now felt empty. At night, he replayed their last conversation, searching for something he might have said differently. He knew this was a trap, but grief rarely followed logic. Months later, the review panel released its findings. It stopped short of assigning blame for Lucia's death, but it acknowledged a deficient climate. Reports of harassment had been mishandled, trust in reporting systems was low, fear of retaliation was widespread, particularly among younger service members. The report recommended changes, training updates, oversight reforms, new reporting pathways. It was progress, according to officials, a step forward. For Sophia and Mateo, it was bittersweet. Nothing in the report brought Lucia back. Nothing answered the central question of how she had been left alone with her fear. But it did something else. It confirmed that Lucia's experience was not isolated, not imagined, not insignificant. They held a small memorial near the coast, far from Fort Calderon. Friends and family gathered, sharing stories that painted Lucia in full color again. Someone brought lavender. Someone else read a passage from one of her favorite books about courage not as the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going despite it. Sophia spoke last. She thanked everyone for remembering her daughter not as a statistic, but as a person. She promised that Lucia's name would not fade quietly into paperwork, that her story would be told again and again until change was more than a recommendation on a page. In the end, there was no dramatic verdict, no single moment of justice. There was only persistence, a family's refusal to let silence be the final word. Lucia Morales' story ended too soon, but its echo remained in policy discussions, in whispered conversations among new recruits, in the growing awareness that endurance should never require suffering alone.
In the spring of 2001, 17-year-old Lena Whitaker was counting the days until summer. She was a junior at Northridge High School in Mesa Ridge, Arizona, a quiet suburb where most people knew one another by face, if not by name. Lena lived in a modest house on a cul-de-sac with her younger stepsister, Emily, and her stepfather, Daniel Whitaker. Her biological mother had died years earlier after a long illness, a loss that reshaped the household in ways that were never fully acknowledged. Daniel had children from a previous marriage, 3 adult sons who no longer lived at home. Inside the house, the dynamic between Daniel and the 2 girls could not have been more different. With Emily, he was relaxed and affectionate, the kind of parent who joked easily and trusted her judgment. With Lena, everything felt tighter. Rules were strict, curfews were enforced down to the minute. Her friendships, clothing, phone calls, and whereabouts were constantly monitored. Daniel often justified this by telling others that Lena needed structure and discipline, that she was more emotional, more difficult, more prone to bad decisions. Lena experienced it differently. To her, the house felt like a place where she was always being watched, always evaluated. Small disagreements escalated quickly. Arguments ended with slammed doors and long stretches of silence. She confided in friends that she felt suffocated, that she counted the hours until she could leave for school or work. Despite this, she was close to Emily and tried to shield her from the tension when she could. Friday, May 18, 2001, was the last day of school before summer break. Lena was excited. She had plans that evening to attend a small end-of-year party with friends. She had talked about it all week, texting classmates and coordinating rides. Emily, meanwhile, was attending an end-of-year school retreat at a local water park with her classmates and teachers. That afternoon, Daniel was supposed to pick Emily up at 3 p.m. When he didn't arrive, Emily waited. After half an hour passed, she walked with a friend to the friend's house nearby. She assumed there had been a delay at work or traffic on the freeway. Hours went by. It wasn't until early evening that Daniel finally arrived, visibly agitated, and told Emily they needed to go home immediately. During the drive, Daniel told her that Lena was missing. Emily remembers feeling confused more than frightened at first. She asked what he meant. Daniel said Lena hadn't come home after school. He handed Emily his phone and asked her to try calling Lena. The call went straight to voicemail. Emily tried again. No answer. When they arrived home, Daniel told Emily to check Lena's bedroom. Inside, the room looked disturbed, not messy in the usual teenage way, but oddly staged. Lena's backpack had been emptied onto the bed. Papers, notebooks, and personal items were spread out. Her cell phone sat on top of the dresser, powered off. That alone struck Emily as strange. Lena never went anywhere without it. Next to the phone was a handwritten note. The note was brief and oddly formal. It said that Lena had decided to leave for California, that Emily had once said she wanted her gone, and that she had taken money from Daniel to support herself. It ended without affection or apology. At first, Emily didn't know what to think. Lena had mentioned an aunt who lived in California, someone she admired and spoke about often. They had talked about the idea of living with her during one particularly bad argument with Daniel.
In that context, the note almost made sense. Almost. That night, Daniel called the police and reported Lena as a runaway. He told officers that she had left voluntarily and that he believed she was heading to California. Based on that information, police opened a missing persons report but did not treat the case as urgent. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of violence, and a note that suggested Lena had left on her own. Days passed, then a week. Daniel told police he had received a phone call early one morning, sometime between 4 and 5 a.m. According to him, Lena called from Riverside, California. He said she sounded upset and accused him of being the reason she left. Then she hung up. Daniel claimed he tried to call back but couldn't reach her. Police asked for phone records or recordings. Daniel explained that he had a home recording system, but that it was turned off at that hour. No record of the call could be verified. Still, the information was added to the case file, and the assumption that Lena had run away hardened into official fact. Emily struggled with guilt. She replayed the words in the note again and again. Had she really said she wanted Lena gone? Maybe once in anger, maybe jokingly. She couldn't remember clearly. What she did remember was Lena crying quietly in their shared bathroom late at night, sitting on the floor with her back against the door, whispering that she couldn't live like this anymore. Months turned into years. Lena never contacted her friends, not her boyfriend, not classmates she had been close to since childhood, not even the aunt she was supposedly going to live with. Her bank account remained untouched. The money Daniel claimed she had taken was never withdrawn. Her social security number was never used. There was no record of her enrolling in school, applying for a job, or renting an apartment. Despite this, the case remained stagnant. Daniel's behavior began to shift. He told extended family members that he feared something terrible had happened to Lena. He speculated that someone might have followed her, that she may have been harmed after leaving home. He told people he felt helpless because the police weren't doing enough. He began making trips to California, posting missing persons flyers in public spaces, and talking openly about his fear that Lena was dead. To some, this looked like a grieving parent searching for answers. To others, including Emily, it felt confusing. Why now? Why the change in tone? In 2007, a letter arrived at the police department from a man incarcerated in Florida for an unrelated murder. The man claimed responsibility for Lena's death, providing vague details and asking for leniency. Investigators eventually determined the confession was a hoax, but during the renewed attention on the case, detectives began reviewing the original timeline more closely. What they found raised questions. School records showed that Lena had not attended classes the entire day she disappeared. Witnesses confirmed that Daniel had picked her up around lunchtime. Her boyfriend told police that Lena had said she was leaving early but planned to meet him later that evening at the party. Several friends said the same. None recalled her talking about leaving town that day. Daniel's explanation was that he picked her up for lunch, they argued at home about rules, and she stormed off to her room. He said he left shortly after to run errands, assuming she would cool down. Investigators also learned more about Daniel himself. He was meticulous to an extreme degree. He kept detailed logs of phone calls. Cameras were installed around the property. There was even a hidden camera concealed in an air vent in the living room. When asked for footage from the day Lena vanished, Daniel said he had reviewed it and found nothing relevant. When asked for audio recordings, he said the system had been turned off that day. By this point, the story was no longer holding together. Police obtained a search warrant for the house. What they found inside would permanently alter the case's direction. The search of the Whitaker house revealed a disturbing and complex picture. Hidden in a small storage room were 26 homemade pipe bombs, carefully labeled and organized. The sight alone was enough to alarm the investigators, but it was the discovery of a 90-page manifesto written by Daniel that turned the case on its head. In the document, Daniel claimed he believed Lena had run away, but he was convinced she had been followed by two men connected to his previous workplace in the electrical union. He described them in detail, outlining grievances from years prior, claiming they had motives to harm him and, by extension, Lena. He stated that he had avenged her by eliminating them, though police records later verified that the men had died of natural causes. The manifesto was filled with paranoia and elaborate narratives. Daniel detailed imaginary surveillance, covert operations, and threats that he believed were looming over his family. Pages were dedicated to diagrams of the neighborhood, routes Lena might take, and hypothetical scenarios in which outsiders could have abducted or harmed her. Investigators later described reading the document as being both frightening and perplexing, as it painted a world in which reality and Daniel's imagination had become inseparable. Amidst the papers and pipe bombs, detectives also found hundreds of hours of audio recordings, meticulously logged conversations, and videotapes covering several years. There were family interactions, phone calls, and footage from the hidden cameras installed in the house. Yet for all this surveillance, nothing provided direct information about Lena's disappearance. Investigators felt they were dealing with a man obsessed with control, who had monitored every aspect of life around him, but had left critical moments of that fateful day unexplained. Letters and contracts signed by Lena also came to light. These documents, formalized at her father's insistence, stated that she had never been sexually abused, a precaution Daniel had demanded to protect the family reputation. Yet friends, teachers, and peers later corroborated that Lena had privately confided her fears about Daniel's inappropriate behavior. One close friend described a harrowing encounter in which Lena recounted being picked up early from school and driven to a secluded area where her father had made unwanted advances. On another occasion, she allegedly awoke to find Daniel trying to gag her with a sock. Daniel vehemently denied all accusations. Police interviews with Lena's friends revealed that she had often felt trapped at home. While Emily experienced their father as fun and lenient, Lena lived under strict, sometimes punitive supervision. Her friends described her as someone who craved independence but was rarely allowed to make her own decisions. Even small acts of rebellion, walking a block to meet a friend, attending a local party, were met with harsh consequences. This dynamic, coupled with the suspicious circumstances surrounding the day she vanished, painted a troubling picture for investigators. Despite these revelations, direct evidence connecting Daniel to Lena's disappearance was elusive. Investigators couldn't locate her body, verify any sightings outside the home on the day she vanished, or find digital footprints in the years following her disappearance. Lena's bank account remained untouched, her Social Security number showed no activity, she had not enrolled in school or sought employment anywhere across the country. It was increasingly apparent that this was not a typical runaway case. As police dug deeper into Daniel's history, patterns emerged that cast further doubt on his narrative. He had a long-standing reputation for obsessive behavior, meticulous note-keeping, and a heightened sense of personal danger. Friends and colleagues described him as both charming and controlling, capable of cultivating trust while simultaneously fostering fear and intimidation. This duality, they said, explained the intensity with which he documented his family's lives, but also the extreme measures he took to control the environment. Investigators realized that the day Lena disappeared, several key details did not align with Daniel's timeline. Witnesses confirmed that Lena had planned to attend an end-of-year party that evening. Her boyfriend, Ethan, recalled that she had promised to meet him after school but never showed up. Friends echoed this, confirming she had told them about her plans to socialize. If Lena had truly intended to run away that day, she had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid leaving any evidence behind, which did not match her typical behavior. The discovery of Daniel's homemade explosives added another layer of urgency and danger to the investigation. Police assessed that while the pipe bombs had not been used, they represented a real threat, not only to the family, but to the broader community. His combination of obsession with control, detailed planning, and access to potentially deadly materials suggested that the disappearance could have been the result of an intentional act rather than voluntary departure. Investigators then turned their attention to Daniel's online communications and interactions at work. Emails, forum posts, and personal journals revealed recurring themes of distrust, fear of retaliation, and paranoia. He wrote extensively about imagined enemies, conspiracies, and scenarios in which he had to protect his family at all costs. Analysts describe these writings as a window into a deeply distorted mindset, one in which Lena's absence was framed as both a personal betrayal and an external threat. While examining Daniel's home environment, authorities also discovered hidden compartments in storage areas that suggested he had been actively concealing items for months or years. Many of these were mundane, old letters, tax documents, photographs, but some contained references to potential plans for preemptive defense against perceived threats. It became clear that Daniel's obsessive surveillance and control extended far beyond typical parental concern. It was a systematic attempt to micromanage every element of his household and external environment. Despite the increasingly suspicious circumstances, law enforcement faced a difficult reality. There was no physical evidence linking Daniel directly to Lena's disappearance. No witnesses had seen him with her after the time he claimed she had left for California. No forensic evidence placed her in the house that day or any other location. Without a body, DNA, or eyewitness testimony, the case remained largely circumstantial, relying on the inconsistencies in Daniel's accounts and the testimony of friends and family regarding Lena's character and behavior. Emily, for her part, struggled with guilt and confusion. She knew she had never fully understood what Lena endured under Daniel's strict supervision. She remembered Lena crying silently in her room, the tense arguments they had over trivial matters, and the whispered confessions about fear and discomfort. She also knew that Lena had expressed a desire for independence, but had never acted on it in the way the runaway note suggested. Emily began documenting everything she remembered, working with law enforcement and a small network of friends who hoped to keep Lena's story alive. The community around Mesa Ridge was unsettled. Neighbors described Daniel as a model father in public, polite and friendly, but in private, the household was tense and isolated. Many residents admitted they had never witnessed anything outwardly concerning, which made the case even more baffling. How could a teenager vanish so completely, leaving no trace from a home that appeared stable to outsiders? The more police investigated, the more they realized that public appearances could be misleading and that Daniel's obsessive control had effectively concealed much of what had happened behind closed doors. By 2008, 7 years after Lena disappeared, investigators had amassed thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours of recordings, and extensive photographic evidence of Daniel's home, his possessions, and his communications. They had spoken to friends, classmates, teachers, and neighbors. Still, they lacked the critical piece: Lena herself, alive or deceased, and the circumstances of her departure. Every lead, hoax letters, alleged sightings, and tips from across the country was scrutinized, but ultimately produced no definitive answers. The pattern of Daniel's behavior, however, had been firmly established. His obsession with surveillance, the extreme measures to monitor and control every aspect of life in the home, the paranoid theories about enemies, and the violent potential represented by the explosives, all of it painted a picture of a father whose actions had created an environment where a teenager could disappear and leave investigators with little concrete evidence. It became increasingly likely that Lena's fate was tied to events within that household rather than any voluntary runaway scenario. In the years that followed, law enforcement and family members continued to advocate for reopening the case, for reevaluating Daniel's timeline and behavior, and for examining evidence that had been dismissed or overlooked. Emily became a vocal advocate for her sister, speaking to local media, attending missing persons conferences, and working to keep Lena's story in the public eye. She also sought therapy to cope with the trauma and unresolved questions, determined to honor Lena's memory while seeking justice. The case remained one of the most perplexing in the region. It highlighted the dangers of unchecked parental authority, the challenges in distinguishing between voluntary disappearance and foul play, and the limits of law enforcement when evidence is scarce. Lena Whitaker's story served as a reminder that behind every missing persons report, there may be a complex web of family dynamics, psychological pressures, and hidden threats that complicate the search for truth. 7 years after her disappearance, Lena's case had shifted from an assumed runaway situation to a suspicious disappearance, dominated by questions about her stepfather's role, his obsessive behaviors, and the absence of any reliable evidence regarding her fate. Investigators, family, and the community were left in a state of uncertainty, each piece of the puzzle hinting at answers that remained just out of reach. The search for Lena was far from over, and every year brought renewed efforts to uncover the truth hidden beneath the layers of secrecy and fear that had surrounded her final day in Mesa Ridge. By 2015, Lena Whitaker's disappearance had entered a new phase. After years of inconclusive investigations and mounting public concern, the Mesa Ridge Police Department began re-examining the case files, prompted largely by pressure from Lena's older stepsister, Emily. Emily had become a tireless advocate, attending community forums, speaking to the media, and maintaining an online presence dedicated to keeping Lena's story alive. She had collected every piece of evidence, every photograph, every recorded tip that had come in since 2001, and compiled them into a comprehensive dossier to present to law enforcement. Emily's advocacy played a pivotal role in convincing the authorities to look beyond the initial runaway classification. The discovery of the pipe bombs, the manifesto, and the inconsistencies in Daniel Whitaker's statements, along with testimonies from Lena's friends about past abuse, had long been ignored or minimized. Now they were central to a renewed investigation. Detectives reopened interviews with former classmates, teachers, and neighbors, looking for anything that might have been missed. Even minor details like a forgotten conversation about Lena's plans for the summer or a neighbor seeing unusual activity near the house were re-examined. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from revisiting the evidence Daniel had carefully preserved in his home. Investigators discovered digital records from hidden cameras and computer logs that had never been fully analyzed in 2001. Some of these recordings captured Lena walking around the house that afternoon, speaking quietly to herself in a way that suggested anxiety and fear. While there was no direct footage of what happened later that day, analysts noted discrepancies in Daniel's reported timeline. According to him, Lena left for California around mid-afternoon, yet video footage indicated she was in her room and moving about well after the time he claimed to have dropped her off or allowed her to leave. Law enforcement also began to scrutinize Daniel's communications from the day of Lena's disappearance. Old phone records and emails revealed strange patterns of messaging between Daniel and former colleagues. Some messages suggested he was anxious about someone interfering with his household, though nothing concrete linked these contacts to Lena's disappearance. Analysts described his behavior as controlling and paranoid, a pattern that aligned with the findings from the original investigation, but now appeared more directly tied to the moment Lena vanished. By 2016, the renewed investigation had taken a more forensic turn. Detectives brought in behavioral analysts to construct a psychological profile of Daniel Whitaker. Experts described him as obsessive, controlling, and paranoid, with tendencies to fabricate narratives to justify his fears. Analysts suggested that Lena, a teenager caught in a home governed by fear and surveillance, may have been placed in a dangerous situation by someone she was supposed to trust. They noted that Daniel's meticulous control, monitoring her movements, hiding evidence, and maintaining surveillance would make it exceedingly difficult for Lena to leave voluntarily. In the years following the reopened investigation, Emily also began collaborating with national missing persons organizations. She attended conferences, networked with families in similar situations, and ensured that Lena's case remained in public awareness. Her persistence led to small but crucial tips from witnesses who had been reluctant to come forward in 2001. One tip indicated a suspicious vehicle parked near the Whitaker home on the day of Lena's disappearance. Another witness remembered seeing a stranger near the property who did not match any family member. While these leads did not immediately result in arrests, they painted a broader picture of the day Lena went missing, challenging the initial assumption that she had left on her own accord. The case began to gain traction legally in 2020, nearly 2 decades after Lena disappeared. Prosecutors reviewed all available evidence and considered filing charges against Daniel Whitaker, not only for possible involvement in Lena's disappearance, but also for the illegal weapons and threats discovered in his home. However, they faced significant challenges. Without a body or definitive forensic evidence linking Daniel to Lena's fate, the case remained circumstantial. Prosecutors stressed that the burden of proof was high and any misstep could result in a dismissal. Despite these challenges, public interest in Lena's story continued to grow. Emily worked closely with journalists, sharing the intricacies of her sister's life, the inconsistencies in Daniel's statements, and the emotional toll on the family. Media coverage brought renewed attention, prompting former neighbors and acquaintances to contact investigators with memories that had previously seemed insignificant. One woman recalled seeing Lena crying in the driveway that afternoon, looking fearful and anxious, while another remembered Daniel checking her room obsessively. These details, while not definitive, strengthened the theory that Lena's disappearance was tied to the environment created by her stepfather. In mid-2021, a team of forensic accountants and digital analysts were brought in to examine Lena's financial and digital footprint. Their review confirmed that her bank accounts remained untouched, her Social Security number was inactive, and there were no online accounts accessed after May 17, 2001. This supported the conclusion that Lena had not voluntarily run away or established a new life elsewhere. Legal advocates also highlighted Daniel Whitaker's history of abusive behavior as a crucial factor. Records of prior domestic disputes, testimony from friends about controlling and aggressive tendencies, and statements from Emily about the tense household environment were presented to prosecutors. The team argued that these patterns, combined with the inconsistencies in Daniel's timeline, created a compelling narrative for his potential involvement. By 2022, the case reached a critical juncture. Investigators, bolstered by modern forensic techniques and historical data, petitioned the courts to reopen criminal proceedings against Daniel. The renewed scrutiny coincided with Emily's advocacy reaching a national audience, bringing additional pressure on local authorities to pursue justice. While Daniel had previously pleaded guilty to unrelated offenses, including the 26 pipe bombs, this new focus centered on the disappearance itself. Prosecutors argued that the evidence suggested Lena had never left voluntarily, and that Daniel's obsessive control created conditions that could have led to her abduction, confinement, or worse. Court filings also revealed that Daniel had failed to preserve critical evidence during the initial investigation, including surveillance footage, audio recordings, and correspondence that might have clarified Lena's movements on the day she vanished. This failure, combined with his prior manipulations of the household environment, led prosecutors to argue that he had intentionally concealed information, undermining the credibility of his original runaway narrative. While the case against Daniel progressed, Emily and the Whitaker family focused on public awareness campaigns. They organized community events, created educational materials about missing persons, and partnered with nonprofits specializing in child safety and domestic abuse. Their goal was not only to pursue justice for Lena, but to prevent similar situations in other families, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability. By 2023, prosecutors formally filed charges against Daniel Whitaker in connection with Lena's disappearance. While the specific charges were not publicly disclosed in detail, court records indicated that authorities were pursuing second-degree murder and obstruction of justice based on the pattern of control, manipulation, and concealment. Emily, now in her mid-30s, became a central figure in court proceedings, providing testimony about her sister's character, the household environment, and her own observations from the day Lena disappeared. Throughout the trial, Daniel maintained his innocence regarding Lena's disappearance, denying any wrongdoing and framing his past actions as protective and necessary. His defense focused on the lack of direct evidence, the absence of a body, and the purported voluntary nature of Lena's departure. Despite these arguments, prosecutors emphasized the overwhelming circumstantial evidence: the pipe bombs, the manifesto, the digital footprint, the hidden surveillance, and the consistent accounts from friends and family describing Lena's fear and attempts to assert independence. The trial, held over several months, became a national focal point for discussions about parental control, missing persons, and domestic abuse. Media coverage detailed the meticulous investigation, the recovered evidence, and the ongoing efforts of Emily and other advocates to bring Lena's story to light. Public reaction was intense, with many expressing outrage over the delay in justice and the systemic challenges that allowed Daniel's narrative to dominate the early investigation. By mid-2023, the court proceedings concluded in a dramatic and emotional session. After 5 days of testimony, the judge dismissed all charges against Daniel Whitaker. The decision cited procedural issues under Arizona Rule 20, noting that while the evidence suggested suspicious circumstances, the court could not definitively prove criminal culpability beyond a reasonable doubt. Emily, devastated but resolute, vowed to continue pursuing justice for her sister through other avenues, including renewed investigative efforts and advocacy for systemic reforms in missing persons cases. By 2024, Lena Whitaker's story had a lasting impact. Her case inspired new protocols for missing teens, highlighting the importance of thorough investigations, timely follow-ups, and the recognition of abuse or coercion within households. Emily's advocacy also led to greater awareness of the psychological impact of controlling parental behavior and the need for resources to support teenagers in high-conflict family situations. As of 2024, Lena's fate remains unknown. Investigators continue to review old leads, interview witnesses, and monitor new tips, while Emily maintains a public campaign to ensure her sister is not forgotten. The Whitaker family has established a foundation in Lena's name dedicated to supporting missing persons, promoting child safety, and funding research into prevention and recovery programs for vulnerable teens. The case of Lena Whitaker stands as a cautionary tale, a story of a teenager trapped in a complex household, a father whose obsessive control created an environment of fear, and a community struggling to reconcile appearances with reality. While the legal system has yet to provide a definitive resolution, the persistence of family, friends, and investigators underscores the enduring commitment to uncovering the truth. Lena's story is a reminder that justice may be slow, but advocacy, awareness, and unwavering pursuit of the facts can keep hope alive even in the face of decades-long uncertainty.